there, so I remember attending the first round of her match, which was a tough match at the US Open, and then I went back home, and then I was contemplating coming back, and I wanted to witness her win, because I think she has such an amazing head on her shoulders, and the game, and I think she has a voice and a platform that's going to, transcend.
She was 5 years old the first time she stood in front of Maria Sharapova and asked for a photo. Nobody in that moment could have known what it meant. Not the little girl from the Philippines clutching a camera, not the 5-time Grand Slam champion posing for one more fan among thousands. But somewhere between that photograph and a July night at Wimbledon almost 2 decades later, something happened that nobody saw coming. And to understand it, you have to go back further than the headlines. Back before the packed stadiums. Back before the Miami crowd started chanting a name that wasn't Jessica Pegula's, even though Pegula was standing on her own home court. Back before Novak Djokovic himself started noticing the line outside an outer court, a line so long it became, in his own words, a good problem to have. Back before Coco Gauff stood at a podium and thanked an opponent for bringing an entirely new demographic into the sport. Back before Billie Jean King, the woman who beat Bobby Riggs in the most famous exhibition match in tennis history, told a 21-year-old from Manila to keep going for it. This is the story of Alex Eala, and it starts with a poster on a bedroom wall. Growing up, Eala kept an image of Sharapova pinned above her desk. She has called it her 5th grade project. She has said plainly that Sharapova was her idol, the player whose relentless chase after every ball she tried to copy on the practice courts of the Philippines. Most kids who tape a photo of their favorite athlete to the wall never get closer to that person than a television screen. Eala got closer. At 13, she left home for Rafael Nadal's academy in Mallorca, trading a normal adolescence for 6-hour training days on Spanish clay, chasing something she couldn't yet name. She has talked about what it meant just to watch Nadal train in person, day after day, the kind of proximity to greatness that can't be replicated anywhere else. It shaped her. But it didn't make her famous. Not yet. For years, Eala was a name tennis insiders tracked in junior rankings and academy reports. A talent, sure, but talent is common in professional sport. What isn't common is a moment. And Eala's moment arrived in the spring of 2025 in Miami, in front of a crowd that had no idea what it was about to witness. She walked into that tournament ranked outside the top 100. She walked out having beaten 3 Grand Slam champions in a row, Jelena Ostapenko, Madison Keys, and Iga Swiatek, the world #1 at the time, on her way to the semifinals. It is the kind of run that simply does not happen to unranked wildcards. It happened anyway. Jessica Pegula, a Miami native who grew up practically inside that tournament, ended up playing Eala in that semifinal on what should have been her own home court in front of her own city. Instead, she has since admitted she felt like the away player. She has said the crowd was entirely against her and that she remembers turning to her team mid-match, stunned, wondering where all these people had suddenly come from. Eala lost that match. But losing it barely mattered, because by the time it ended, something had already shifted permanently. She became the first Filipina to crack the WTA Top 100. Months later, at the US Open, she won her opening match, the first Filipina in history to win a match at a Grand Slam. 2 records, 1 summer, and a fan base that hadn't existed at the start of the year suddenly stretching across an entire nation and its diaspora. By the time the 2026 season began, the crowds weren't a surprise anymore. They were a pattern. And the pattern had gotten big enough that even the most decorated man in the history of the sport was paying attention. At the Australian Open, Novak Djokovic, a 24-time Grand Slam champion, was asked about the growing spectacle around Eala, and he didn't dodge it. He said he'd seen it himself, the crowds, the noise, all of it. And he framed it as something bigger than one player's popularity. He talked about entire countries discovering tennis fandom for the first time because they finally had someone of their own to cheer for. Coming from someone who has spent 2 decades watching the sport's biggest moments unfold from center court, that wasn't a throwaway line. It was an acknowledgement that something structural was happening in women's tennis, and Eala was at the center of it. Then came Dubai. Pegula, The same player who'd felt like a visitor in her own city 8 months earlier, won the tournament outright, beating Elina Svitolina in the final. It should have been her spotlight entirely. Instead, in her own championship press conference, reporters kept steering the conversation back to Eala, to the crowds that had followed her through the draw yet again, to the sheer scale of the following she had built in under a year on tour. And Pegula, who had every reason to want the moment to be about her own title, didn't deflect. She called Eala amazing. She talked about how Eala carries the weight of an entire country's expectations with what she described as real maturity and grace, always seeming grateful rather than burdened by it. She said she wanted Eala on her own podcast to talk about it properly. That same week, Coco Gauff, after facing Eala on court, thanked her publicly for bringing a new audience into the sport altogether, acknowledging that playing in front of a crowd that loud, that partisan, isn't easy, and choosing to frame it as good for tennis rather than as a threat to her own moment. Two of the most accomplished young players on tour, both essentially saying the same thing in the same week. This isn't hype. This is real, and it's bigger than any one match. But nothing that had happened yet compared to what was coming at Wimbledon in July of 2026. Eala walked onto the grass at the All England Club and, in the third round, faced Iga Swiatek, the defending champion, the world number 1, the same player she'd beaten in that first Miami breakthrough over a year earlier. This time, there was no element of surprise. Swiatek knew exactly who she was playing. It didn't matter. Eala won in straight sets, 7-6 in a tie-break that stretched to 9 points, then 6-2, dethroning the defending Wimbledon champion in one of the most stunning upsets of the entire tournament. It made her the first Filipino player, man or woman, to reach the round of 16 at Wimbledon in the tournament's open era. And this is where the story folds back on itself in a way that almost nobody could have scripted. Within hours, Maria Sharapova, the woman on the poster, the 5-time major champion Eala had idolized since she was 5 years old, holding a camera up for a photograph, posted her reaction publicly. 2 words. What a star, not a paragraph. Not a press conference-length tribute. 2 words. From the exact person whose game Eala had spent her childhood trying to imitate. Sit with that for a second because it's easy to let it pass by too quickly. This is a woman who won Wimbledon herself as a 17-year-old, who built one of the most recognizable careers in the history of women's sport, who has watched thousands of talented juniors come and go without ever bothering to publicly acknowledge most of them. And she didn't just notice Eala's win. She called her a star, using the same word that gets used sparingly, carefully, by people who understand exactly how much weight it carries when they choose to use it. Billie Jean King did more than post about it. She spent time with Eala in person right after that Wimbledon win, the same King who beat Bobby Riggs in 1973 in a match that became a landmark moment for gender equality in sport. King said meeting Eala fresh off that historic result was a genuine pleasure, and she called her an inspiration for kids not just in the Philippines but everywhere. Then she left her with 4 words, keep going for it. From a Hall of Famer who has spent over half a century defining what it means to open doors in this sport for people who'd never had them opened before, that wasn't a polite line for a photo caption. That was one legend recognizing another legend in the making. And here's the part where the story refuses to sit still and just be a triumph, because real stories rarely do. Just days after that stunning defeat of Swiatek, Eala lost in the very next round, the round of 16 she'd fought so hard to reach, falling in 3 sets to Jasmine Paolini. The same tournament that handed her the biggest win of her career took it right back within 48 hours. That's the part highlight reels tend to skip. The euphoria of beating a defending champion, and then, almost immediately, the gut punch of falling short of the quarterfinals against a player ranked and battle-tested at exactly this stage of majors. Analysts picking apart her game afterward didn't hide the truth either. Her serve, by hard statistical measure, still sits well outside the top 50 on tour. A technical gap that even admirers acknowledge needs closing if she wants to turn breakthrough runs into sustained title contention. This isn't a story about a finished product. It's a story about a 21-year-old still being built in real time, in front of an audience of millions, with every flaw exposed right alongside every triumph. So where does that actually leave her? Not at the top? Not yet. She sits in the young middle of a career that could still bend in almost any direction, toward the sustained dominance her idol once had, or toward the far more common fate of a player who peaks early and never quite closes the gap between potential and hardware. But here's what makes this different from 1,000 other promising young player stories that fizzle out and get forgotten. The people vouching for her aren't casual observers. They're the sport's own royalty. A 24-time major champion who watched the crowds form with his own eyes. A world number 5 who felt like a visitor on her own home court because of the noise Eala generated. A Wimbledon champion who thanked her publicly for changing who shows up to watch tennis. And a 5-time Grand Slam winner whose poster hung on Eala's childhood wall, now publicly calling the kid who once asked her for a photo an actual star. That last one is the detail that makes the whole thing land differently than ordinary sports hype. It isn't a manufactured narrative built by a marketing team. It's a 5-year-old's photograph 16 years later, answered back in 2 words by the same woman who was in it. Whether Eala ever wins the Grand Slam title her results so far suggest she's capable of chasing, nobody can promise. What's already true and already verified, and already sitting in the public record for anyone to check, is that in the space of about 14 months, she went from outside the world's top 100 to a player the greatest names of 2 generations felt compelled to speak about, unprompted, in their own words. That part isn't hype. That part already happened.